A call for help. In a distant galaxy, far beyond the reach of any human exploration, a peaceful alien species known as the Sylphs lived on a lush and serene planet. Their society had flourished for centuries without war or conflict. They had mastered the arts of science and peace, living in harmony with nature and their technology. Life was simple for the Sylphs, and they valued their tranquility above all. But that peace was about to be shattered. It all began one quiet evening when the ground trembled beneath their feet. The sky, usually calm and blue, turned a deep, ominous red. The animals scattered, and the trees shook violently. A massive shadow darkened the sky as something unknown approached their world. It was like nothing the Sylphs had ever seen before, a dark, foreboding force that moved faster than anything they had ever encountered. The first sign of the impending doom came when the skies were filled with strange ships, dark and menacing, that circled around their planet. These ships came from a place beyond their knowledge, and as they hovered over the Sylph cities, they unleashed their terrifying power, destroying everything in their path. The Sylphs tried to fight back with their advanced weapons, but it was useless. The enemy was too strong, too advanced. In a matter of hours, the Sylphs found themselves overwhelmed. In their desperation, they turned to their most desperate option, a call for help. Their technology, which had once been used for peace and exploration, now became their only hope. They activated their ancient communication system, reaching out to anyone who might hear their cry. But as they sent their distress signal into the vastness of space, they felt the crushing weight of uncertainty. The signal was weak, and they had no way of knowing if anyone would receive it, or if it would even reach a living soul. The Sylph's message was simple but urgent. We are under attack. Our world is dying. We need help. It echoed across the stars, bouncing off distant planets and star systems. Would anyone answer? The Sylphs had no idea. Their hope was fading fast. Hours turned into days, and the attacks continued. The Sylphs could no longer keep up with the enemy's brutal onslaught. Cities were reduced to rubble, and entire forests burned to the ground. There was no place left to hide. The enemy's weapons were powerful, and their soldiers were relentless. The Sylphs had no answer to the destruction that rained down upon them. As the planet's atmosphere grew thick with smoke and despair, a small group of Sylphs gathered in a secret chamber. They watched the skies through a window that once offered a beautiful view of the stars. Now, all they could see was the destruction that had fallen upon their home. Their leader, a wise elder named Solana, stood in the center of the room, her face drawn with worry. "Is there anyone out there?" Solana whispered to herself. The others in the room gathered around her, their faces pale with fear. "We've done everything we can," she said, her voice heavy. "Our weapons are useless. Our ships are no match for them. We are out of time." One of the younger Sylphs, a courageous young woman named Lyra, stepped forward. "We can't give up. We have to keep hoping. Our people can survive this. We can find a way." Solana looked at Lyra, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I hope you're right, child," she said softly. "But time is running out. We have no way of knowing if anyone is listening. The galaxy is vast, and our call for help may never reach anyone." Lyra shook her head. "We can't stop trying. The universe is too big, and there must be someone out there who will hear us." As the days passed, the once proud civilization of the Sylphs continued to crumble. The attackers showed no signs of stopping. It was clear that the Sylphs needed help, but the question remained, who would come to their aid? Who could possibly fight against such overwhelming power? In their final moments of hope, a response came. It was faint at first, just a blip of static, almost impossible to decipher. The Sylph's communication system crackled to life. The message, though garbled, was clear enough to make their hearts skip a beat. "We heard your call. We are coming." The message was short, but the words sent a ripple of hope through the hearts of the Sylphs. Who was it? What kind of beings would respond to such a desperate plea? The message was not clear, But the Sylphs had no choice but to hold on to that glimmer of hope. For the first time in days, Solana allowed herself a small smile. "They are coming," she whispered. "Someone is out there." The Sylphs waited, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and fear. They had no idea who these mysterious beings were, but they had no choice but to trust that help was on the way. And so, as the sun began to set on their war-torn planet, the Sylphs could only hope that the fleet arriving to save them would not only be their salvation but their last hope. Little did they know, the beings who were coming were unlike anything they had ever imagined. Beings who thrived on survival, whose very existence was built on overcoming the impossible. The Deathworlders had heard the call, and they were on their way. The first part of their story had just begun. The Deathworlder fleet arrives. The skies above the Sylphs' shattered world grew darker still as an unfamiliar fleet of ships appeared on the horizon. Unlike anything the Sylphs had seen before, the ships didn't have the sleek elegance of their own advanced designs. Instead, they looked like a collection of jagged metal, built for war rather than beauty. The Sylphs watched, hearts racing, as these strange ships descended from the heavens, their massive forms cutting through the smoky clouds like predators hunting their prey. The ships weren't like the sleek, technologically advanced vessels the Sylphs were accustomed to. They were terrifying, ugly, massive, and built for combat. Each ship was covered in dark, rough metal that looked like it had been forged in the heat of battle itself. They weren't pretty. They were brutal. As the fleet drew closer, the Sylphs began to feel an unsettling mixture of awe and fear. These ships were not designed for peace. They were built for war. The silence was deafening as the ships hovered above the ground. The Sylphs had never seen anything like this before. The enemy they had fought so desperately to defeat seemed like nothing compared to the threat that now loomed above them. The ships didn't land immediately. Instead, they hung in the sky, almost as if they were studying the planet below, watching the dying world with cold, calculating eyes. Then, a voice crackled over the Sylphs' communication system. It was deep, gruff, and filled with an intensity that made even the bravest of them flinch. "We've received your signal. We are the Deathworlders. Stay out of our way." The message sent a wave of panic through the Sylphs. Deathworlders. The name alone sounded like a warning. What kind of beings called themselves the Deathworlders? Were they allies, or were they a new threat to be feared? Before they could even begin to process what had just been said, the ship slowly descended to the planet's surface, their landing gears scraping the ground like giant claws. The ground trembled beneath their weight as the Sylphs' last hope arrived. The ships finally landed, and the air around them crackled with an eerie energy. Moments later, the doors of the ships opened, revealing their passengers. Figures clad in battle-worn armor, faces obscured by helmets. They moved in unison, like a coordinated swarm of deadly predators. The Deathworlders weren't just any aliens. They were survivors, born and bred in environments where only the strongest lived. They hailed from planets that were considered death worlds, places where life was a constant struggle against harsh, unforgiving conditions. On their home planets, only those with the most powerful instincts survived. These beings were the epitome of that strength. The Sylphs looked on in shock and awe as the Deathworlders stepped onto the planet's surface. Their presence alone exuded power and fear. Their armor, dark and intimidating, reflected the moonlight, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Every step they took sent a shiver down the Sylphs' spines. Their leader, a towering figure clad in black, raised a hand to silence the murmurs. He spoke in a voice that carried the weight of 1,000 battles. "We are here to save you. But understand this, help comes at a price. You are not our equals. You will prove yourselves worthy, or you will fall." The Sylphs, still stunned, were uncertain of what to do. These beings were not like the peaceful allies they had hoped for. The Deathworlders did not speak of compassion or mercy. They spoke of power, of proving one's worth. What had they gotten themselves into? The leader of the Deathworlders, sensing the fear in the Sylphs, gave a small, unsettling smile. Do not mistake our presence for charity. You will learn to survive or perish. That is the way of the Deathworlders. As the fleet settled in, the Sylphs had no choice but to accept the reality. The beings who had arrived to save them were unlike anything they had expected. These were not rescuers with warm hearts and peaceful minds. They were warriors, and survival was their only language. The first question echoed in the minds of the Sylphs. Could they trust the Deathworlders, or were they simply the next threat to their already dying world? The tension hung heavy in the air as the Deathworlders began their preparations. The Sylphs had no choice but to wait and watch, wondering if they had made the right choice by calling for help. First impressions of the Deathworlders. The Sylphs watched with a mix of awe and fear as the Deathworlders began to move across their broken landscape. Every step they took seemed to shake the ground beneath them, like the very earth recognized their power. These beings were not like any race the Sylphs had encountered before. They weren't peaceful explorers or diplomats seeking trade. They were warriors, the likes of which the Sylphs could hardly comprehend. The Sylphs, for the most part, were slender and graceful, their movements elegant and purposeful, shaped by centuries of peaceful living. In contrast, the Deathworlders were built for survival, with broad shoulders, strong limbs, and an intimidating stature. Their armor was thick, dented from countless battles, and their faces were hidden behind blackened visors that gave them an almost monstrous appearance. As the Deathworlders approached, the Sylphs instinctively took a few steps back. These beings radiated an aura of strength that sent chills down their spines. The Deathworlders didn't walk. They stalked, their boots crunching the charred earth beneath them, their movements purposeful and deliberate. The Sylphs could feel the weight of their gaze, the unsettling power that seemed to come from every inch of their being. The air itself felt heavier with each passing second, as if the Deathworlders' very presence was altering the atmosphere. One of the Deathworlders, a towering figure with a scar running down the side of his face, stepped forward. His eyes, though obscured by the visor, seemed to pierce through the Sylphs like a predator sizing up its prey. The leader of the Sylphs, Solana, stepped forward, trying to hide the unease in her voice. "We are grateful for your arrival. But what is it you want from us?" The Deathworlder leader's helmeted face tilted slightly, as if considering the question. After a moment, he spoke in a voice that was deep and resonant, sending a tremor through the air. "What?" He gave a short, unsettling laugh. "What we want is simple. We want you to survive. That's all." The Sylphs exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that survival, in the Deathworlders' eyes, was something far more brutal than they had ever imagined. There was no promise of peace, no comforting words about rebuilding their world. The Deathworlders didn't speak of saving lives. They spoke of survival, of strength, and of the harsh reality of life in the galaxy. But what did that mean for the Sylphs? Could they truly learn to live in a world where mercy was scarce and survival was a constant battle? As the Deathworlders moved through the ruins of their cities, they began inspecting the wreckage. The Sylphs watched as they moved with cold efficiency, assessing the damage, identifying weak points in the defenses, and making notes in their databanks. It was clear that they weren't here to comfort. No, they were here to teach the Sylphs what it truly meant to fight for survival. The leader of the Deathworlders turned back to the Sylphs, his expression unreadable behind the visor. "You're soft," he said bluntly. "Your weapons are weak. Your cities are fragile. This enemy you face, they're not like you. They won't stop until you're all dead. You need to be stronger. If you want to live, you'll have to fight. And you'll have to learn from us." Solana's heart sank as the full weight of the situation hit her. These beings didn't view them as allies. They saw them as a challenge, a test of survival. The Deathworlders weren't here to save them out of compassion. They were here because they enjoyed the thrill of battle, the harshness of survival. They didn't come to offer refuge. They came to forge warriors. Lyra, the young Sylph who had remained hopeful despite everything, felt a surge of dread. "But we've never fought like this," she said, her voice trembling. "We've never had to." The Deathworlder leader turned to her, his expression cold and calculating. "You will now." In that moment, the Sylphs realized just how little they understood about the harsh realities of the galaxy. The Deathworlders weren't teaching them to rebuild what they had lost. They were teaching them to adapt, to fight, and to survive against all odds. There was no room for weakness. There was no space for fear. The Sylphs, once so proud of their peaceful existence, now stood on the brink of a new reality, a reality where only the strong would survive. The Deathworlders had arrived not as saviors, but as merciless teachers. And the lessons were about to begin. An unexpected alliance. The first day of training was brutal. The Deathworlders didn't waste time with pleasantries or introductions. They began with the harshest of lessons, the kind that the Sylphs were unprepared for. The soldiers did not explain anything in detail. They only demonstrated, pushing the Sylphs to their limits. There was no gentle guidance, only survival, pain, and the constant reminder that weakness would be punished. Under the unforgiving glare of the sun, the Sylphs found themselves thrust into a grueling training exercise. The Deathworlders didn't care for their peaceful background or the fact that they had never fought in such conditions. They weren't interested in diplomacy. They had one goal: to forge survivors out of the soft, fragile beings who had once lived in harmony with nature, with no concept of true battle. Lyra, the young Sylph who had remained hopeful, was the first to feel the harshness of the Deathworlders' methods. She had always been quick and agile, but when she was ordered to engage in combat, the speed and precision of her movements were no match for the Deathworlder soldiers. The first few attempts left her winded and bruised, unable to keep up with the punishing pace set by the relentless warriors. "Faster," barked one of the Deathworlders, a woman with a scar over her left eye. "Survive or perish. Your world depends on you now." Lyra gritted her teeth and tried again, but her body was exhausted. The weight of the weapons was unlike anything she had ever felt. Her muscles screamed for rest, but the Deathworlders didn't allow for weakness. There was no break, no reprieve. Each move had to be calculated, efficient, and precise. They didn't care that the Sylphs were not fighters. They only cared that they would learn to be. Meanwhile, Solana, the leader of the Sylphs, watched with a heavy heart. She had hoped the Deathworlders would teach her people how to survive without destroying their essence. But as she saw the brutal way they trained, the relentless pushing, the constant pressure, she began to realize that these warriors were not concerned with preserving the Sylphs' peace-loving nature. They wanted warriors, beings who could fight, who could survive, who could face death without flinching. By the end of the first day, the Sylphs were covered in bruises, cuts, and exhaustion. But they had learned something crucial. The Deathworlders were not here to be their allies in the traditional sense. They weren't here to help them rebuild. They were here to teach them how to survive, no matter the cost. As the sun began to set, Lyra collapsed onto the cold ground, gasping for air. Beside her, one of the Deathworlders crouched down, offering her a water canteen. Lyra hesitated for a moment, unsure of the Deathworlders' intentions. But then her parched throat won over, and she accepted the offer. The warrior didn't say a word as Lyra drank, watching her silently. "You are weak," the Deathworlder finally said, her voice gruff. "But you are learning. That's all that matters." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "You could have let us die with dignity. Why teach us to fight like this?" The Deathworlder tilted her head, studying Lyra carefully. "Dignity means nothing in the face of death. You either survive or you don't. It's that simple. Your species was weak, and it was going to get you killed. We are here to change that." Lyra was silent for a long moment, processing the words. Could it be that the Deathworlders weren't completely heartless, that they had a strange sense of honor in their brutal methods? Maybe, just maybe, they wanted to teach the sylphs something more than just how to fight. Maybe they were trying to show them that survival was more than just a fight. It was a way of life. It was a philosophy, a constant battle against the universe itself. The next day, as the training continued, Solana approached the Deathworlder leader. He stood alone, watching the training from a distance, his posture rigid and unwavering. His eyes were unreadable behind the visor, but Solana could sense the weight of the moment in his presence. "We are grateful for your lessons," Solana began, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But we are not warriors. We don't know if we can become like you. You teach us to survive, but we cannot forget what we once were." The Deathworlder leader turned to her, his expression cold but not unkind. "I know. You weren't born for this, but you can adapt. We are teaching you to face what you could never have imagined. You may hate it, but in the end, you'll be alive. And that's all that matters." Solana stared at him, her mind racing. There was truth in his words, no denying it. The galaxy was a cruel place, full of threats that could destroy them in an instant. The Deathworlders might not be offering the kindness they once imagined, but perhaps survival itself was a kind of gift. Maybe, in their own brutal way, the Deathworlders were offering the only help they truly could. The harshest lesson of all was that the sylphs had to choose: stay weak and die, or grow strong and survive. Their alliance with the Deathworlders wasn't a promise of kindness. It was a promise of strength, even if it came with blood and scars. Solana took a deep breath, looking toward the brutal training fields where her people were fighting to stay on their feet. She had no choice now. They had to adapt. For their world, for their survival, and for what remained of their people, they had to become something they had never thought possible. And so, the sylphs began to understand. They weren't just learning to fight. They were learning how to survive in a universe that didn't care about their past, their peace, or their ideals. They were learning the brutal, undeniable truth. To live, they would have to become warriors, like the Deathworlders, and to do that, they would have to forget everything they thought they knew about life. The first step in their transformation had been taken. The battle for survival had only just begun. Training begins. A test of will. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and dust as the sylphs struggled to keep up with the unforgiving pace of the Deathworlders' training. Each new exercise felt like a test of their very existence. The warriors didn't stop to check on them, didn't offer a word of encouragement, and certainly didn't show any signs of sympathy. Their sole purpose was clear. The sylphs had to evolve, or they would be wiped out. The lessons were not for the faint of heart. Lyra, though exhausted, found herself pushing harder with each passing day. Her body ached in ways she never thought possible, and the bruises from the previous day's training were still fresh on her arms and legs. But she had learned something about herself. She was more than the timid, peace-loving creature she had once been. The relentless training was burning away her fear and hesitation, turning her into something new, something sharper. She didn't know if she was becoming stronger or just learning to survive, but there was no time to wonder. The Deathworlders, however, were relentless. Each day, they ramped up the intensity, throwing the sylphs into scenarios that tested their minds, their strength, and their ability to think on their feet. There were no breaks, no relief. Every lesson felt like it could be their last. They were pushed to their limits, made to fight, to think, to react in ways they had never been taught. One afternoon, Solana found herself standing in the center of a massive arena made of scorched stone, surrounded by the other sylphs. The Deathworlders stood in a circle around them, their eyes cold and unfeeling as they observed. The warriors spoke little, only watching and waiting. The silence was as oppressive as the heat. Solana knew that today was going to be different. Today, the sylphs would face their greatest challenge yet. "Your mission is simple," the leader of the Deathworlders called out, his voice booming. "Survive the day. You'll face one of us. Fight as if your life depends on it." The sylphs exchanged nervous glances. They had never been trained for hand-to-hand combat. Not like this. Their bodies were designed for agility, for speed, for precision, not for brute force. Yet, here they were, facing a deadly challenge that could end their lives in a matter of seconds. Lyra was chosen first. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, her legs unsteady beneath her. She had seen the Deathworlders in battle, and the thought of facing one of them in combat made her stomach turn. The Deathworlder opponent she faced was a massive armored warrior, at least twice her size, with cold, calculating eyes that seemed to bore into her very soul. He stood unmoving, as if waiting for her to make the first move. The moment she charged, everything became a blur. The Deathworlder moved with terrifying speed, his armor glinting in the harsh sunlight as he dodged her strikes with ease. He barely seemed to acknowledge her presence as he parried each of her attacks, his movements precise and deadly. It felt as though she was fighting against a wall of stone. No matter how hard she struck, she could not break through. Lyra fought with every ounce of strength she had, her body screaming with exhaustion, but her opponent remained relentless. She was fast, but he was faster. She was agile, but he was brutal. It wasn't just a physical fight. It was a mental one too. She realized with a shock that he wasn't just testing her strength. He was testing her will. Would she give up? Would she let the fear take over? Or would she find a way to push through? Lyra's mind raced as she tried to think of a strategy, anything that might turn the tide in her favor. She was growing weaker by the second, but the thought of failure burned in her chest like a fire. She couldn't afford to lose. Not now, not after everything they had endured. The Deathworlder struck again, sending her crashing to the ground. Pain exploded across her body, but she refused to stay down. She pushed herself up, her hands shaking. The warrior's cold, impassive gaze never wavered. But Lyra saw something in his eyes, a glimmer of respect, perhaps. He was waiting for her to break. Instead, she surged forward once more, her body trembling with the effort. With a desperate, last-ditch effort, she feinted left, then right, and launched a low strike aimed at his legs. It wasn't a powerful blow, but it was enough to catch him off guard. He stumbled. That moment of hesitation was all Lyra needed. In one swift motion, she ducked under his guard, landing a hit to his chest. It wasn't a fatal blow, but it was enough to make him stagger. She could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes as she pushed forward. Breathing heavily, her body trembling, Lyra held her ground. For a moment, the arena was silent. The other Deathworlders observed in stillness, their expressions unreadable. Finally, the leader spoke. "Not bad, Sylph," he said, his voice gruff. "You lasted longer than most. You're not the fastest, but you have the will to survive. That's something." Lyra stood there, breathing hard, her heart racing. She had passed the test, not by being stronger or faster, but by pushing through her fear, her exhaustion, and her doubt. She had learned something important in that moment. Survival wasn't just about power. It was about refusing to give up when everything in your body screamed for you to stop. The Deathworlders didn't offer congratulations or praise. They simply moved on to the next self, their cold gaze shifting from one to another as they prepared for the next test. But for Lyra, it was a small victory. She had learned a crucial lesson that day. To survive, you had to fight, not just with your body, but with your mind. The Sylphs were beginning to realize that this was no longer about just learning to survive physically. It was about learning to endure, to push past their limitations, to keep fighting when all hope seemed lost. And the Deathworlders were only too happy to test them to the breaking point. The final battle. The day had come. The training was over, or at least, the training the Sylphs had known. For weeks, they had been pushed to their limits, breaking their bodies and spirits only to rebuild them again. Stronger, faster, more resilient. They had faced their fears, confronted their weaknesses, and learned to survive. Now, the true test awaited them. The enemy, the same relentless force that had devastated their world, was finally arriving. The Sylphs had no choice but to face them in a battle that would determine whether they would live or die. The Deathworlders had drilled them, tested them, shaped them into something new. But this was no longer a lesson. This was war. The battlefield was a ravaged stretch of land, once lush and vibrant, now scorched and barren from months of conflict. The sky hung low with smoke, and the air was thick with tension. The Deathworlders stood at the front, their eyes hard and unfeeling, as they prepared the Sylphs for what was to come. Lyra stood beside Solana, her body tense with both anticipation and dread. Her fingers gripped the weapon she had learned to wield during the brutal training, her knuckles white from the pressure. She had never fought like this before, but she had learned something important in those weeks. Fighting wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about keeping your focus, using your mind, your willpower. It was about never backing down, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. As the ground rumbled beneath their feet, a massive fleet of enemy ships appeared on the horizon. The Sylphs' hearts sank as the massive shadows of the invaders loomed closer, their ships like dark, ominous predators descending toward them. It wasn't just the size of the ships that terrified them. It was the unrelenting force they knew was coming. This wasn't a simple invasion. It was an annihilation. The enemy had no interest in mercy or negotiations. They had come to finish what they had started. The Deathworlders, standing tall and unshaken, turned to face the Sylphs. Their leader's voice cut through the air, calm and commanding. Prepare yourselves. Today, you fight not just for survival, but for the very future of your species. The enemy will stop at nothing to erase you from this world. Fight with everything you have. Lyra took a deep breath. She had seen the horror that awaited them, and she knew what had to be done. Her thoughts were clear now. She had to fight, not for herself, but for her people, for her planet. The Deathworlders had trained them to survive, but now they would fight to protect everything they had left. The battle began with a deafening roar. The enemy ships fired their weapons, sending waves of destruction across the battlefield. The Sylphs fought in sync with the Deathworlders, each move a reflection of the brutal lessons they had learned. There was no hesitation, no fear, only instinct, only survival. Lyra found herself charging toward the front lines, her body moving with a grace and precision she had never known. She was no longer the timid, unsure sylph she had been. She was a fighter, a survivor. The enemy came at her in waves, but she pushed forward, using every ounce of her training, every ounce of her strength to fend them off. But it wasn't just physical strength that would win this battle. As the fight raged on, Lyra saw what the Deathworlders had truly taught them. It wasn't about brute force. It was about tactics, strategy, and using every advantage to outwit your enemy. The Deathworlders had shown them how to read the battlefield, how to anticipate the movements of their enemies, how to strike when they least expected it. Lyra ducked beneath a blast, rolling to the side and landing in a crouch. She could hear the chaos around her, the screams of battle, the clash of weapons, the hum of energy shields. The world was a blur of sound and motion, but she stayed focused. She spotted an opening, a gap in the enemy's defenses, and she charged. Her strike was swift and precise, a quick jab with her weapon that took down one of the invaders. It wasn't a fatal blow, but it was enough to buy her a moment. She pushed forward, weaving through the chaos, never stopping, never looking back. Solana was nearby, leading the charge, her face set in determination. She had always believed in peace, in diplomacy, but now she knew that survival required something more. Something brutal, something harsh. She fought with the same intensity as the Deathworlders, no longer relying on the idealistic hopes she had once clung to. This was not a war for ideals. This was a fight for their very survival. Hours passed, each moment dragging as the Sylphs battled the invaders with everything they had. The Deathworlders moved among them like shadows, teaching them, guiding them with a brutal but steady hand. There were no words of encouragement, only the cold certainty that failure was not an option. But as the battle raged on, Something began to shift. The sylphs, who had once been timid and unsure, began to fight like the Deathworlders. They had learned, they had adapted, and they had become something new. The invaders, once so sure of their victory, began to falter, their lines breaking as the sylphs pushed forward with relentless determination. It wasn't until the sun dipped below the horizon that the enemy finally retreated, their ships fleeing into the distance, leaving behind the wreckage of the battle. The sylphs stood victorious, but the cost had been great. The battlefield was littered with the fallen, both their own people and the invaders. The air was thick with smoke, and the sounds of the battle still echoed in their ears. Lyra stood amidst the carnage, breathing heavily, her body battered and bruised. She had survived. They had survived. The Deathworlders stood nearby, silent and watchful, their faces unreadable beneath their helmets. The leader stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the battlefield. "You did well," he said quietly, his voice calm as always. "You've proven that you can survive. Now you are no longer weak. You are warriors." For the first time since they had met, the sylphs looked at the Deathworlders not with fear, but with understanding. They had been forged in fire, tested and tempered by the brutal training and the final battle. They had learned what it truly meant to survive. And now, they were no longer just the sylphs, peaceful, fragile creatures. They were something more. They were survivors. They were warriors, and the galaxy would learn to fear them. Victory and a new beginning. The battle was over, but the aftermath was something the sylphs would never forget. The smoke from the fiery explosion still hung in the air, the scent of burning metal and scorched earth mixing with the stale remnants of gunpowder. Bodies, both of the fallen invaders and their own people, lay scattered across the battlefield. The once proud cities of the sylphs, now reduced to rubble, seemed eerily quiet in the wake of the destruction. Yet, amid the chaos and loss, there was an undeniable feeling that something had changed. The sylphs had won. Against all odds, they had held their ground, pushed through the fear, and stood tall in the face of overwhelming destruction. They had done more than just survive. They had fought back, and they had emerged victorious. But as they surveyed the battlefield, there was no celebration, no jubilant cries of triumph, only silence, only the understanding that the cost of victory had been immense. Lyra stood at the edge of the battlefield, her body sore and covered in cuts and bruises. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but her heart was steady. She had fought, she had endured, and in the end, she had survived. She looked around at the others, her fellow sylphs, once so full of doubt and hesitation, now transformed. They were no longer the same peaceful beings they had once been. They had been forged in the fire of battle, and though they had lost much, they had gained something new: strength, resilience, and a new sense of identity. The Deathworlders stood apart from them, their expressions unreadable beneath their helmets. They had fought alongside the sylphs, but their role had always been clear. They were not here to offer friendship or compassion. They were here to teach the sylphs how to survive, to become something more than the weak, peaceful creatures they had been. And in that, the Deathworlders had succeeded. Solana approached Lyra, her face grim but proud. "We did it," she said quietly, her voice filled with both relief and sorrow. "We survived. But at what cost?" Lyra nodded, glancing over the battlefield. "We've lost so much, but we've gained something too. We've gained the strength to protect what's left. We're not the same people we were before. We're different now." Solana's eyes flickered toward the Deathworlders, who were already preparing to leave, their work done. She had never expected to rely on such harsh beings, but now, in the aftermath of the battle, she understood. The Deathworlders had given them the gift of survival, and though their methods had been brutal, they had saved the sylphs from extinction. The leader of the Deathworlders approached them, his voice low and unwavering. "You fought well," he said. "You proved yourselves. But understand this, you are not done. Survival does not end with one battle. The galaxy is filled with enemies, And you must always be prepared. Never forget what you've learned. Lyra looked at him, her mind racing. She had learned something important in this war. It wasn't just about winning battles. It was about knowing that survival was a constant, unrelenting challenge. The universe was a hostile place, and the sylphs would have to face its dangers head-on, armed with everything the Deathworlders had taught them. But in that moment, Lyra realized that survival wasn't the only thing the sylphs had gained. They had learned how to be strong, not just physically, but mentally. They had learned to face adversity with courage, to push through their fears, to become something they had never thought possible. They had learned to fight, to protect, and to rebuild. And now they had to decide what kind of future they wanted to create. The Deathworlders gave them one final look, their eyes filled with the quiet knowledge of countless battles fought. "You are stronger now," the leader said. "But strength alone will not keep you alive. The galaxy will test you again. Be ready." With that, the Deathworlders turned and walked away, their ships rising into the sky, disappearing into the stars as quickly as they had arrived. The sylphs watched them go, their hearts heavy but filled with a new understanding. They had been shaped by the Deathworlders' brutal training. But now, they had to forge their own path. The war was over, but the real battle had just begun. Solana turned to face her people, her voice steady but resolute. "We will rebuild, but we will rebuild differently. We will remember what we've learned, and we will never forget the cost of this victory." The sylphs gathered around her, their faces determined. They had lost their innocence in the fires of war, but they had gained something far more powerful, the will to fight for their future. As the stars twinkled above, the sylphs looked to the horizon, knowing that they would never again be the fragile beings they once were. They were survivors now. And whatever the galaxy threw their way, they would face it together, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. This was their new beginning.